Everybody likes to talk about how to write a great chorus, and often people show a lot of love to the first verse because it's sort of the listener's first impression of your song. But one of the most forgotten parts of a song is often the intro, which is funny because we consider the first verse important because it's kind of people's first impression of a song, but really their first impression is actually in the intro. And the intro is really easy to just phone in and just assume that it should be something that basically is the same music as the verse just before the vocal comes in, but really the intro is an opportunity to make sure to do something really interesting and make sure to hook the listener for the rest of your song, and certainly is not a part to just be forgotten about. It should be thought through more than just taken for granted as, oh, we'll just have it be the music of the verse. So what is the job of an intro? Let's talk about it. So one of the main jobs of an intro is to set the emotional tone for the song. The intro of your song should give the listener some idea of where the song is headed. Just like reading the first chapter of a book should give you some idea of what type of book you're reading. Are you reading a historical fiction? Are you reading sci-fi? Are you reading fantasy? You should have some idea of that based just on the first chapter. In the same way, our intro shouldn't be false advertising. It shouldn't be clickbait, if you will. It should set up the rest of the song, which is not to say that it needs to be a section that is necessarily repeated ever again in the song. You can have an intro that actually is totally different music than you will ever have in the song. As long as it still sets the same emotional tone, it will be totally fine. Common things to do with the intro are to simply have the verse music, maybe with an added lead guitar or a lead part that actually just starts the song, and then eventually the vocal comes in. And usually, depending on how interesting the background music is for the verse, for example, if it's a really interesting piano riff that's actually quite interesting on its own, then maybe you just start with that piano riff. But if it's just a guitar strumming a chord progression that's not that interesting, maybe that's when you should have a lead part or something to make your intro more interesting. I think a really helpful way to think about the intro of a song is to compare it to a cold open in most sitcoms, especially since about 2000, 2005, especially ones like The Office, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and Parks and Rec, where they have that first scene that may or may not connect to the rest of the episode. Often it sets up the rest of the episode, but really the goal of that cold open is right away to get you to laugh and have a single clip that really works all on its own as a joke, and you really don't necessarily need to watch the whole episode for context. It just gives you a quick laugh to make you be like, oh, okay, this show seems funny, and then you stick around for the rest of the show. And your intro is sort of the same idea, except probably without the laughs. But instead, you're trying to convince the listener, okay, this is an interesting song. Maybe I should stick around for the rest of the song. I think one of the other main jobs of an intro is to really hook the listener and also to be instantly recognizable. I think one of the bigger sins a song can commit is when somebody is like, yeah, I don't really recognize a song all the way until the chorus. Yes, the chorus is probably going to be the most recognizable part of most songs, but we want our intro to be interesting enough that within 1, 2, maybe 3 seconds, people are already like, oh, I know this song, and they're turning the volume up on the radio or whatever they're listening to your song on. And there are tons of ways to be instantly recognizable. You can have a really interesting piano riff, or an interesting guitar picking pattern, or maybe an interesting or different bass line, or a drum beat that will catch somebody's attention and sounds different than your traditional drum beats, or even just interesting sound design can be instantly recognizable, where the sound of that synth or the sound of that guitar is so different from any other sound that people have heard that it's instantly recognizable. So at the end of the day, what you don't want listeners saying is, what song is this again? Instead, we want people to hear the intro of the song, be like, oh, this song. And then hopefully they're turning the volume up. So hopefully you found this helpful. And if you did, you'll probably also find my 10 different ways to start writing a song free guide helpful as well. Because something that we can all get stuck on is writing songs from the same standpoint and starting from the same place in our songwriting, which often then results in our songs starting to sound the same, which then usually results in us getting more and more creatively dry. And then we get frustrated we write less, and then sometimes we even go months without songwriting just because we are frustrated and feel like we can't come up with anything creatively. But usually that's a self-inflicted wound because we always start our song from the same standpoint. And it's good to have our bread and butter. It's good to have different things that tend to be your go-tos, your tried and trues, but we do need to make sure to break outside of that shell, whether that be for just changing up our process so that all our songs don't sound the same, or just to make sure we don't go creatively dry. So for me, my go-to tends to be a piano riff. I like to start songs with an interesting piano riff that tends to be the backdrop of my verses. But if I just always do that, eventually I sit at the keyboard or the piano and end up being like, I feel like I've written all the different ones, which of course I haven't, but you start to go creatively dry. So then when I actually grab my guitar and start with a finger picking pattern, or I come up with a bass line first, or I actually start with an interesting piece of imagery that I find really compelling, then that's when my creativity comes back and I'm back to being excited about songwriting and my creativity can flow again. But if I just keep writing songs from the same standpoint with write a piano riff, write a piano riff, write a piano riff, that's when I tend to go creatively dry. And you may relate to this as well, especially I think for a lot of songwriters, the tendency is to start with a chord progression on the guitar. They sit down with their guitar and start strumming chords, and that's where they start their song. So that could be your piano riff. So that might be where you tend to get stuck, or where you have found yourself eventually being like, I don't know, these songs are starting to sound the same, or I feel like I'm really not into it as much, or I'm not coming up with as good stuff as I used to. A great way to make sure you start writing great stuff again and you don't stop writing great stuff is to change it up. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out. Free guide in the description down below. It's at songwritertheory.com/free guide. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll talk to you in the next one.